Nobody in Mangwon Market moved. A man's hand was around a woman's wrist. His suit cost more than the entire stall. The tattoo on his neck was the kind of detail people memorized so they could describe it later. 4 men in black stood behind him, and the market held its breath, and nobody was going to say a word. Then a child appeared. 7 years old, pink dress, box braids with red beads, round glasses, hands on her hips. "Don't touch my mom." He stared at her, and something in him stopped. Something that had not stopped in 7 years. He didn't know why yet, but the answer had been standing in front of him the whole time. "Okay, stop right there, besties, because I need you to fully understand what just happened." A 7-year-old girl, pink dress, Peter Pan collar, beaded braids, round glasses, hands on her hips, just made the most feared man in Seoul take a step back. No weapon, no backup, no plan. Just Aradem, completely unbothered, standing in the middle of Mangwon Market like she owned every square inch of it and was simply allowing others to use it. But here is the part that is going to keep you up at night. The man she just stared down, the man who just released her mother's wrist and took a step back from a 7-year-old in a flower-scented dress, has spent the last 7 years tearing this city apart trying to find them. He doesn't know that yet. Not fully. Not in the way you know something when you finally let yourself say it out loud. But something in him paused in that market in a way it has not paused in 7 years. Something in him looked at those eyes, steady, certain, utterly unafraid, and felt the ground shift beneath his feet in a way he cannot explain and is not yet ready to examine. She has no idea. The most powerful man in Seoul just met his match, and she is wearing a Peter Pan collar. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you personally and find out just how far our story is traveling. Because what happens next, when Park Ho gets the file, when he reads the date, when he looks up from that page and tells Do-won they are going back to the market, nobody in that office was ready for it, and neither are you. Aradem did not move. She stood exactly where she'd planted herself, and she did not flinch. She did not blink. She was doing the thing she always did when something required her full attention. Taking inventory. The suit. Expensive. The tattoo climbing his neck. Dark and deliberate. The 4 men behind him still as posts. The controlled quiet he wore around himself. The stillness of a man who'd learned long ago that he didn't need to raise his voice to be the most dangerous thing in a room. None of it registered as a reason to step back. She said it one more time. Same tone. No extra force. Because it didn't need any. "I said let go of my mom." Something passed through Park Ho's face. Brief. Gone before anyone could name it. He looked at Aradem for a long moment. Then at Celine, who'd gone completely still behind her daughter, one hand pressed against her chest, barely breathing. Then Park Ho released the wrist, not with anger, not with dismissal, with the slow, careful deliberateness of a man making a choice he didn't fully understand yet. He looked at Aradem one more time. She looked back with the calm of someone who'd already moved on to the next item on her list and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. He turned, walked away. His men fell in behind him. The market exhaled. The woman near the cabbage resumed reaching for it. The delivery cart began moving again. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday reconstructed themselves, quickly, completely, as though nothing had ever disturbed them. One of the suited men looked back, twice. At the car, Do-won fell into step beside Park Ho, close enough to speak quietly. "Sir, that child. Find out who they are," Park Ho said. He got in. The door closed. Do-won stood on the pavement for 1 second, then he reached for his phone. Behind the stall, Celine had already pulled Aradem behind the partition screen, both hands on her daughter's shoulders, running over them, checking, the way mothers check when they're frightened and trying not to show it. Her hands were not entirely steady. "What were you thinking?" Her voice was low and controlled and carrying, underneath, the specific frequency of a woman who just watched her child walk into something that could have ended very differently. Aradem looked up at her mother, completely calm. "I was thinking he needed to let go." Selene stared at her daughter. Then she pulled her in and held her, tight, close, chin on top of Aradem's braids, and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that mattered more than that. Aradem patted her mother's back with the patient steadiness of someone comforting a person who'd earned it completely. "It's okay, Mom," she said. "He's gone now." But Selene held on a little longer. Because she knew, in the way she knew things she couldn't afford to examine during market hours, that the man whose wrist her daughter had just talked her out of was not the kind of man who stayed gone, simply because a 7-year-old had told him to leave. The file arrived the next morning. Doan placed it on Park Ho's desk at 8:47. Said nothing. Stepped back. Park Ho was already seated. He looked at the folder for a moment before opening it. Then he opened it. Her name, her age, her hometown, a city 3 hours south. The kind of place people came from when they were starting over and wanted distance between themselves and whatever they were leaving behind. Arrival in Seoul, 2 years prior. Current address, a small apartment 20 minutes from Mangwon Market. Occupation, seamstress, sole operator of stall 14, East Corridor. Key, read it. His hand stilled on the page. He read it again. He set it down. Sat in complete silence. Long enough that Do-won understood this wasn't the silence of a man preparing a response. This was the silence of a man who just felt the ground move and was standing very still, waiting to understand which direction everything had shifted. "Sir," Do-won said carefully. Park Ho didn't look up. "How old is the child?" Do-won found the line. 7, sir. Born. He stopped. He looked at the date, looked at it again, then looked at his employer. Park Ho hadn't moved. He was staring at the middle distance somewhere above the desk, not at the wall, not at anything in the room, at a place that existed slightly outside it. Do-won said nothing. There was nothing in 8 years of service that covered this moment. So he waited. Park Ho stood, walked to the window. The city moved below, indifferent, continuous. He stood there with his hands loose at his sides and something working, behind his expression that hadn't been allowed to work there in years. "We're going back to the market," he said finally. "Sir. Tomorrow." "Yes, sir." Do-won left quietly. He stood in the corridor for a moment before walking away. In 8 years, he had never once seen Park Ho read anything twice. The black cars arrived at Mangwon Market at 9:30. No announcement. No stated reason. Just the vehicles at the east entrance, the way weather arrives. Without explanation, simply present. Aradem saw them before anyone else did. She was on her stool, arithmetic book in her lap, pencil behind her ear. She looked up. Saw the cars, saw the suits, ran her 3-second assessment. Then she closed her book, climbed down with great dignity, and walked across the market. Park Ho had barely cleared the entrance when she appeared in front of him. She stopped, looked him up and down with the attention of someone updating their notes on a situation previously documented. "You came back." "I had business nearby," Park Ho said. Aradem looked past him, at the cars, at the direction he'd come from, back at him. The polite skepticism on her face was so perfectly constructed that the suited man on Park Ho's left had to look at his shoes immediately. "Your business is near my mom's stall again," she said. "That's twice." Park Ho said nothing. She studied him a moment longer. "Are you going to cause trouble?" "No." She weighed this, arrived at a provisional conclusion. "Okay, but I'm watching you." She turned, and then, Because a very large and complicated problem clearly required active supervision, she walked back to him, positioned herself to his left, and began escorting him through the market with the composed authority of someone who had decided this was her responsibility and was not open to discussion about it. Park Ho walked beside her. De Juan, following at a distance, reached up and adjusted his earpiece and said nothing and continued observing. Celine heard them before she saw them. Aradem's footsteps, purposeful, slightly too fast for her legs, and then another set beside them. Heavier, measured. She looked up from the fabric she was pinning. She went completely still. Aradem arrived at the stall, stepped behind the table and looked at her mother with the expression of someone delivering a self-evident piece of information. "Mom, he's hungry. Feed him." "Aradem." Celine's voice carried several layers simultaneously, none of them simple. Aradem met her mother's eyes, then looked at Park Ho, then at the empty stool beside the table, then back at her mother. "Mom, food." Celine looked at her daughter. Then at this man in his expensive suit standing beside her market stall, being managed by a 7-year-old. Something moved through her face, too complicated to name and too brief to examine. She turned back to her table, picked up her ladle. Park Ho sat down. By the end of the first week, the arrangement had structure. Aradem had decided, somewhere between Tuesday and Thursday, that formalization was required. She located a wooden crate near the back of the stall, dragged it into position with considerable effort and zero assistance because she hadn't asked for any, and retrieved her black marker from the front pocket of her school bag. She wrote on the side in large, careful letters, "P.H. Work in progress." She stepped back, tilted her head left, made one small adjustment to the H, nodded once. "So there's no confusion," she said to nobody in particular. Marker back in the bag. Park Ho read it when he arrived that afternoon, read it again, then sat down on it without comment. The precise, controlled movement of a man who had decided not to have feelings about this and was fully committed to that decision. De Juan, 20 feet away near the fruit display, made a sound, brief, immediately suppressed. But it happened. Their routine built itself. Park Ho arrived. Aradem appeared, inspected, escorted. Celine fed him without ceremony. Aradem sat on her own upturned crate and talked. The way some people breathe, naturally, continuously, as though silence was simply a condition that happened to other people. She told him about school, about Mrs. Beck, strict in the principled way Aradem respected, not the arbitrary kind, which was a completely different thing and worth distinguishing. About her best friend Gia, who was extremely dramatic, had once cried for 40 minutes over a broken pencil, which Aradem had documented as excessive, but had revised her position on since, because Gia was also the person who shared her lunch without being asked on the day Aradem forgot hers. And that kind of loyalty deserved some latitude on the pencil situation. Park Ho listened, he ate, he said little, but he was there, present in the way of someone paying close attention and choosing not to advertise it. There was also this boy, Aradem said one afternoon, legs swinging. He took my eraser, just picked it up off my desk like it was available. "What did you do?" Park Ho said. "I gave him a look." A pause. "He apologized," she continued. "And we're now actually very good friends, because I respect people who know when they're wrong. Being wrong isn't the problem. The problem is when people know they're wrong and just keep going anyway." She looked at Park Ho over her glasses when she said that last part. He looked away. The corner of his mouth moved. Barely, briefly, there, and gone. De Juan turned fully toward the fruit display. His shoulders were doing something he was working hard to contain. Celine, behind the table, kept her eyes on her stitching. But her needle paused for just a second, then resumed. Here is what none of them said out loud. Park Ho came back every day and told himself it was business. Celine kept her hands busy and told herself it was manageable, and Eridem said nothing at all. Because she was 7 years old and already understood, in the way some children understand things before they have words for them, that some situations need time more than they need talking. She was giving it time. 3 weeks in, a Thursday afternoon, the market quiet. The light coming in golden low through the overhead awning, turning the steam from the tteokbokki stalls amber. Celine was across the corridor speaking to her fabric supplier. Park Ho sat on the work-in-progress crate. Eridem sat beside him. Arithmetic book open, legs still for once. Then she took off her glasses. She cleaned both lenses on the hem of her dress. Methodically. The way she did when she was preparing to say something that required complete clarity. She put them back on. Adjusted them, looked at Park Ho directly. "Can I ask you something serious?" "You ask me serious things every day," Park Ho said. "This is more serious than the others." She held his gaze, and in her expression there was something different from her usual precision. Something quieter, more careful. The look of a child who has been thinking about something for a long time and has finally decided the thinking is done. "You lost something," she said. "Didn't you?" Not a question. Park Ho went very still. "A family," Eridem said. Simple, direct. The way she said the things that mattered. Without armor, without build-up, just setting it down in the open air between them. "You sit on that crate and you go quiet, like you're trying to remember something, like this place smells like whatever you lost." Park Ho said nothing, but something was happening behind his eyes, something old and large and barely held. She reached over without hesitation, put her small hand on top of his. Both her hands were barely the size of one of his. She placed them there with the complete confidence of someone who had considered the gesture and determined it was correct. She looked up at him. "Did you have a little girl before?" Something cracked open behind Park Ho's eyes. Enormous, controlled. Barely held. He excused himself. He stood, said something brief. Walked around the corner of the stall into the narrow delivery corridor. Stood against the wall. Looked at nothing. Dohwan found him 2 minutes later. He'd been watching from the fruit display. He'd seen Eridem take off her glasses. He'd seen the conversation, though he couldn't hear it. He'd seen Park Ho stand and leave with the particular quality of movement he associated with moments that required privacy. He came around the corner and stopped a few feet away. "Sir." Park Ho didn't look at him. His jaw was tight. His voice, when it came, was not right. Not the grinding stone voice, not the controlled neutral voice. Something Dohwan had never heard before. "Her eyes," Park Ho said. "Look at her eyes, Dohwan." Dohwan turned, looked back across the market. Eridem was on her crate again, book open, pencil. Retrieved from behind her ear, legs swinging, completely composed, as though the most important question she would ever ask had simply been filed, and she was now waiting, with the patience of someone who already knew the answer, for the world to confirm it. Dohwan looked at those eyes. Then he looked back at his boss. He said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. He had already seen it. Everyone who looked carefully enough had seen it. And some things, when they are this large, require the person at the center of them to arrive at the truth on their own timeline. Park Ho stood against the wall a little longer. He wasn't ready yet. But he was close, and Eridem, across the market, swinging her legs and doing her arithmetic, was in no hurry. She had waited this long. She could wait a little more. That evening, Park Ho opened a second file. He did it standing at his desk in the dark. Didn't turn on the lamp. Just pulled the folder from the bottom drawer. The one he'd had for years, the edges soft from handling, and opened it in the light coming through the office window from the city below. He knew every line of it. He read it anyway. The night of the raid, 7 years ago. The sequence of events as reported to him in the weeks after. when he was still rebuilding and the losses were still being counted and everything had the quality of something viewed through cracked glass. Present. Real. But not fully in focus. Celine had been in the building when the raid began. The man responsible for her evacuation was Quan Jie, his second in command. 4 years of trust. Quan had reported back within the hour. She'd been caught in the initial breach. She hadn't made it out. Park Ho had believed that for 4 years. 4 years of carrying something with no correct place to be put. Not grief, exactly. Something more specific than grief. A weight that sat in the chest regardless of what you placed on top of it. He'd placed a great deal on top of it. It hadn't moved. Then the first sighting surfaced. A city in the south. He'd told himself it was nothing. He'd investigated anyway. Because he was not a man who left things uninvestigated. And the investigation had come back inconclusive. But something had shifted. Something had stopped believing Quan's report. And once it stopped believing, it could not be made to believe again. So he'd started looking. 3 years of looking. Quietly, methodically. The way Park Ho did everything, and she had been 40 minutes from his office. He picked up his phone. Do-wan. Sir. Find Quan Jie. A pause. Sir, Quan Jie has been in Busan for the last 2 years. He runs a... Find him tonight. The pause this time was shorter. Do-wan had learned to hear the specific quality of certain instructions. Yes, sir. The call with Quan Jie came through at 11:43. Park Ho answered on the second ring. He didn't say hello. He said, "Tell me what happened the night of the raid. All of it. The parts you reported. And the parts you didn't." Silence on the other end. The silence of a man calculating. How much was known. Whether concealment was still an option. Whether the call itself had already answered that question. Then Quan Jie told him. He'd found Celine before the breach reached her. Got her out. Took her somewhere safe. Told her Park Ho was dead. That the raid had been conclusive. That there was no recovery. That if she stayed anywhere near Park Ho's world, his enemies would find her and use her to finish what they had started. He'd told her to run, given her money and a direction, watched her leave. Then he'd reported back to Park Ho that she hadn't made it. He'd done it, he said, because her presence in Park Ho's life was a liability. Because men like Park Ho couldn't afford the kind of attachment that could be used against them. He'd made a calculation, a cold, organizational calculation, and the calculation had told him that removing her was correct. He believed he was protecting the organization. He said this with the tone of a man who had told himself this story so many times it had become simply true. Not a choice. A thing done for good reasons. A necessary cost. Park Ho let him finish. Then Park Ho said, very quietly, she was pregnant. The silence on the other end changed quality entirely. I didn't, Quan Jie began. Park Ho hung up. He set the phone down with care, the same deliberate care with which he'd released Celine's wrist in the market. The practiced gentleness of a man controlling something enormous by keeping his hands very still. He sat in the dark. The city moved outside the window. The office was quiet. And what settled over Park Ho in that quiet was not anger. Though the anger was there, solid and cold, it would keep. What settled over him first was the full shape of it. 7 years. She'd been running from a lie for 7 years. She'd built a life on a false foundation, grieving a man who wasn't dead, raising a daughter alone, keeping her hands moving every day so that the feeling underneath couldn't catch up. And the daughter, that small person with the round glasses and the beaded braids, who had walked up to him in a market and told him to let go of her mother, had grown up with the shape of something missing, not knowing what it was, just knowing it was there. 7 years. Because one man had made a decision that wasn't his to make. Park Ho sat in the dark for a long time. Then he reached into the bottom drawer of his desk, the one below the file, and took out what was inside. Held it in his hand for a moment. Thin silver chain. Broken clasp. The weight of it almost nothing. The weight of what it meant something else entirely. Tomorrow, he thought. He'd go back to the market tomorrow. He came back the next morning with the bracelet in his jacket pocket. Aradam met him at the entrance, conducted her inspection, noted that he looked like a man who hadn't slept and chose not to comment on it, and escorted him to the stall. She installed him on the work-in-progress crate, settled on her own, and opened her reading book. The morning moved in its usual rhythm. Celine sewed. Aradam read and offered occasional observations on the story that nobody had requested, but that Park Ho listened to in full. Do-won maintained his post near the fruit display, with the expression of a man who had accepted his assignment. In the late afternoon, a regular customer arrived, the chatty kind. She and Celine moved to the far end of the table to look at a garment. Their backs were turned. Park Ho reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the bracelet, placed it quietly beneath the edge of the work table. Far enough under that it wouldn't be seen until someone wiped the surface down. He said nothing about it. Put his hand back in his lap. Looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has done what he came to do. Aradam, from her crate, watched him do it. She looked at the edge of the table where the bracelet had disappeared, then at Park Ho's face. She looked at it the way she looked at things she was filing for later. Not yet, but soon. Then she went back to her book. She said nothing. That evening, after the last customer had gone and Aradam had been walked home by the neighbor, Selina wiped down the work table. Her cloth caught on something at the edge. She reached under. Her fingers found metal. Thin. Cool. She pulled it into the light. A silver bracelet. Thin chain. Broken clasp. The break she recognized because she'd caused it herself. That last night, pressing it onto his wrist too fast in the dark, the clasp snapping under the urgency of the moment. Neither of them had stopped to care. She turned it over. On the inside of the band, in small engraved letters, "For when you find your way home," her own words. She had chosen them herself, standing in a jeweler's on a Wednesday afternoon 7 years ago. She'd pressed it into his hand that last evening and said, "Come back to me." He'd closed his fingers around it and said nothing. Because Park Ho said things with his hands and his stillness rather than words. She'd understood. Then Kwon Jae had come, and she had run. And she had spent 7 years not looking at this, not allowing herself to look at it directly, because looking at it meant also seeing what had been lost, and she'd learned quickly that some losses, if examined fully, will swallow you whole. She was still holding it when she felt the change in the air. A presence at the entrance of the stall. She looked up. Park Ho was standing there. No car, no men, no announced purpose, just him in the empty evening market, hands in his pockets, watching her hold the bracelet in both hands. He hadn't left it there by accident. Something was working in her chest that had no name and no container. She looked at him for a long moment. "How long?" she said, steadier than she expected. "How long have you been looking?" "Since the day I stopped believing what Kwon told me." A breath. 3 years. She closed her fingers around the bracelet. "He told me you were dead." The market was very quiet around them. Evening vendors packing up, distant street sounds, the ordinary sounds of a city with no idea what was happening in the space between these two people. The silence held 7 years. All of it. Every day of it. All the decisions made inside it. "Tomorrow," Park Ho said finally, "we need to talk." She nodded once, looked down at the bracelet in her hand, put it in her pocket, began closing the stall. Park Ho stood at the entrance a moment longer, then walked away. Neither of them said anything else. Everything else required more room than a market entrance at the end of an evening could hold. The restaurant was small and nearly empty. A corner table, low light from a single lamp mounted on the wall. Above them, The smell of sesame and cold tea. 2 cups in front of them that neither had touched. Selene spoke first. She'd decided it on the walk over. If she waited for Park Ho to begin, she'd spend the first 10 minutes arranging her responses rather than simply telling the truth. And she was tired, so tired, of the arrangements she'd built around this particular truth. She'd been carrying it for 7 years. She was going to put it down now. All of it. In her own order. She put her hands flat on the table, looked at them for a moment, then looked up. She told him everything. What Kwon had said that night. The specific words. The specific certainty he delivered them with. Not cruelly, not kindly, just with the clear-eyed practicality of a man who'd made a decision and was executing it. She told him about the money and the direction and the instruction to move fast and not look back. She told him she'd moved fast and not looked back because she was 22 years old and frightened. And the man she'd trusted to come back to her had just been declared dead by someone she had no reason to doubt. She told him about Busan. 2 years in a city she knew no one in. Working whatever work she could find, building the smallest possible life in the smallest possible pieces, because small things were all she could hold without dropping. She told him about the morning she understood she was pregnant. A rented bathroom, cold tile under her hands, the silence of early morning around her. The decision she made in that silence. Not complicated. Not dramatic. Just a woman who understood exactly what she was capable of, making a promise to herself and to the small fact of her daughter's existence, and keeping it every day from that morning forward. She told him about Seoul, arriving with almost nothing, finding the market, building the stall from nothing. Learning how to make a life that was complete in itself. Not a waiting room, not a temporary, hoi arrangement. A real thing, a full thing. Something she and Aradem had built without anyone's help, and that she was proud of with the specific pride of someone who knows exactly what it cost. She told him about Aradem, the way she'd arrived in the world. Fast, certain, already fully herself. The way she'd grown into herself more every year, like a person born with a complete knowledge of who she was and simply in the process of demonstrating it. She told him all of it, and when she finished, the restaurant was quiet. The lamp above them buzzed once. Neither of them moved. Park Ho had not moved during any of it. He sat with his hands on the table and his eyes on her face, not waiting for his turn to speak. Receiving what was being given to him, understanding it for what it was. "I've been looking for you for 3 years," he said. His voice was different, stripped, the controlled layer gone. "Before that, I was convinced you were gone. I believed what Kwon told me for 4 years. Then I stopped believing it and I started looking and I haven't stopped. A beat. I've been living inside 7 years of the wrong thing, Selene." She put the bracelet on the table between them. He looked at it for a long time. Then, "She has my eyes." Almost quiet enough that she might have missed it. But she didn't. "She's always had your eyes," Selene said. "I told myself for the first 2 years I was imagining it. That I was seeing things because I needed to see them." She looked at the bracelet. "I stopped telling myself that." A breath. "She has your stillness, the way she goes completely quiet when she's made a decision. Not thinking anymore, just decided. The corner of her mouth that almost moves but doesn't, just once, when something is funny, and she doesn't want to show it. The way she looks at a person when she's taking their measure." She looked up at him. "She's been looking at you the way she looks at herself in the mirror. I think she knew before either of us said anything." Something broke loose in Park Ho's expression. Not the wall coming down. Something more precise. A specific load-bearing piece, removed. The look of a man who's been carrying something so long he forgot it had weight. And has just, for the first time, felt it lift. "What do we do?" he said. "We tell her the truth," Selene said. "Together, carefully, on a day soft enough to hold it." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at her. Not the assessing look. Not the controlled neutral look. Something open. Something that didn't have a guard in front of it. "I never stopped," he said. She knew what he meant. Not the searching. The other thing. The thing that neither of them had named, because it didn't need naming. She held his gaze. "Neither did I," she said quietly. "I just had to." It wasn't forgiveness yet. It was the thing that comes before forgiveness. The thing that makes it possible. The thing that says, "I see all of it, and I'm choosing to stand here." Anyway, a door. Open. Both of them at the threshold. Neither of them moved through it yet. But both of them were there. The cold tea sat untouched between them. The lamp buzzed once more. Outside, Soul moved on without them. That was enough for now. They chose a Sunday. Celine had thought about it for 2 days. Not a weekday. Aradem came home from school already full of the day. Not a Saturday, with its own energy. Sunday. Their softest day. The day with no schedule, no urgency. The day that moved at the pace of late breakfasts and open windows, and Aradem drawing at the kitchen table while Celine read, and the morning simply unfolded. Park Ho arrived at 10. He wasn't wearing a suit. Celine had seen him in a suit every single time. Always black. Always the controlled presentation of a man who wore authority the way others wore their skin. He stood in the doorway of her apartment in dark trousers and a plain dark shirt, collar open, and he looked, not smaller, not less, something more accurate than either. He looked like a man. The way a person looks when they've removed the things they wear to be seen a certain way and are simply themselves underneath. He was slightly uncertain. She had never seen him slightly uncertain before. Aradem opened the door. She looked him up and down. The full inventory. Noted the absence of the suit. The absence of the men. The particular quality of his expression. 4 seconds. Then she stepped aside. "I've been expecting this," she said. They sat in the small living room, Celine and Park Ho on the sofa, Aradem across from them in the armchair, the one she'd claimed as her thinking chair in the second week, and that nobody had argued with her about since. She sat with her legs folded under her, glasses on, hands folded in her lap, completely composed. The look of a child who'd done the necessary thinking and was simply present for what came next. Celine leaned forward. "Baby. Soft. Careful. We need to tell you something important." Aradem nodded. No performance, no drama. Just her full attention, present and waiting. Park Ho leaned forward too, elbows on his knees, closer to Aradem's eye level. He looked at this child who'd walked up to him in a market and told him to let go of her mother and hadn't moved an inch since. This small, impossible, entirely complete person. He opened his mouth. He had no idea what to say. In his adult life, Park Ho had given instructions that moved money and people across the city. He'd negotiated across tables from men who'd have preferred him dead. He'd delivered hard news, the final door-closing kind. In none of those situations had he opened his mouth and found it simply empty. He looked at Aradem. Aradem looked back. Then she said, "I know." Celine went still. "What?" "I figured it out on the bracelet day," Aradem said, completely calm. "I saw your face when you found it, Mom. And I've been looking at his eyes for 3 weeks. She tilted her head toward Park Ho. "You have my eyes, or I have yours. One of those." Park Ho stared at her. "I wanted you to tell me yourselves," Aradem continued. "So I waited." She said it without armor, without performance, just setting it down. "I thought you needed time to be ready, so I gave you time." The room was very quiet. Park Ho looked at this 7-year-old who'd been sitting across from him on an upturned crate for 3 weeks, swinging her legs, doing her arithmetic, filing his almost smiles, waiting, with the infinite, deliberate patience of someone who'd already done all the thinking, for the adults to finish catching up. Aradem unfolded from the thinking chair. She crossed the living room, stopped in front of Park Ho and looked up at his face. Not with her inventory look, not with her assessment precision. Something more careful than that. The look of a child who knew what she was looking at and was taking her time with it. "You searched for us," she said. "For 7 years," Park Ho said. Aradem absorbed this. She stood with it, felt its weight, gave it the respect it was due. Then she reached up and took his face in both her hands, one on each side of his jaw, the way a child holds something precious and breakable, with the careful, complete tenderness of someone who has decided that this thing is now their responsibility. "You found us," she said. Simply, completely. "So you can't go again." A breath. "That's the rule." Something happened to Park Ho's face, not the corner of his mouth moving once, not the wall adjusting. The whole thing, every layer of cold, every constructed distance, every year of carefully maintained control. Going somewhere else entirely, all at once, without his permission, and beyond his ability to stop it. His jaw worked. His eyes were bright. He was losing whatever battle he'd been fighting for the last 30 seconds. He knew it. He had stopped caring. He pulled Aradem gently toward him. She came without hesitation. Arms around his neck, braids swinging forward, her small weight settling against his chest with the complete trust of someone who has already decided this is where she belongs and is simply, finally, arriving there. He held her. This man who'd built an organization on the understanding that attachment was liability, who had moved through the world for 7 years treating softness as something that happened to other people. He sat in a small living room on a Sunday morning and held his daughter for the first time and made no attempt whatsoever to contain what was happening to him. Celine watched from the sofa, one hand pressed flat over her mouth, eyes full of something she hadn't let herself feel directly in 7 years. She didn't look away. She watched every second of it. The room was quiet for a long time. Then, from somewhere against Park Ho's shoulder, muffled by the fabric of his shirt, a small voice. "Dad." Park Ho closed his eyes. "Yes," he managed. A pause. "Can I call you that?" Thoughtful. Considering. "Or is work in progress still better?" A sound came out of Park Ho. Half laugh, half something with no name. The sound a man makes when something enormous and private gets surprised out of him by a 7-year-old with beaded braids and no filter between thought and speech. He held her tighter. His shoulders shook once. Celine laughed. Sudden and real. The kind that arrives before you can arrange your face around it. Completely genuine, completely surprised by itself. She pressed her fingers over her mouth and laughed anyway, and the tears that had been threatening arrived, and she let them, because there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to arrange, nothing left to be careful about. "Dad is good," Park Ho said, when he could say anything. The controlled neutral voice entirely gone, something new in its place, warm and rough, and completely unrecognizable from the man who'd stood in a market 3 weeks ago and told a child to move. "Dad is very good." Aradem nodded against his chest, the satisfaction of a correct conclusion after a rigorous process. She pulled back slightly, adjusted her glasses, looked at Park Ho, then at Celine, then back at Park Ho, one remaining item on the list. "One more thing," she said. "Yes, Aradem." She glanced at her mother, then back at him. "Do you love my mom?" The room held its breath. Park Ho looked at Aradem. Then, slowly, with the measured care of a man who understood that the next few seconds required precision, at Celine. Celine looked back at him. A warning, a question, and underneath both, something softer than either. Something she hadn't let herself show him before. Something kept carefully in the place where she stored things she couldn't afford to examine. It was visible now. Briefly. Completely. Park Ho looked back at Aradam. I'm working on it, he said honestly. Aradam considered this, turned it over thoroughly, without rushing, then gave one slow, solemn nod. Okay, that's acceptable. She patted his arm, the air of someone approving a work in progress showing genuine improvement. I have a plan. I'll give you time. She looked at him over her glasses. But not too much time. She settled back against his chest, pulled her glasses straight, looked across at Celine with the expression of someone whose business was concluded and who was ready for the next phase of the morning. Mom. Celine looked at her daughter. This small, enormous person who'd walked into a market 3 weeks ago with her hands on her hips and her braids swinging and had proceeded, with the methodical patience of a 7-year-old who had all the time in the world, to fix everything. I think this is a special occasion, Aradam said. Can we have jollof rice and chicken? Selene stared at her. Then she laughed. Long and real and full. The laugh that had been building since the moment Aradam crossed the living room and took Park Ho's face in her small hands. It came out completely. Warm, genuine, surprised by itself. And the tears came with it, and she let them both. Yes, baby, she said when she could say anything. Jollof rice and chicken. Aradam nodded, settled more comfortably against Park Ho's chest, completely at home, completely certain, the way she was certain about everything that actually mattered, bone deep. The certainty of someone who knew before anyone else and had simply been waiting for the world to confirm it. Park Ho sat very still. He felt the weight of her. Small and warm and trusting in the way people are trusting before the world gives them reasons not to be. Completely. Without reservation. With the whole of herself. He looked across the room at Selene. She was already looking back at him. The door between them still open. Both of them standing at it. Closer now than they'd been in the restaurant, closer than they'd been in the market, moving toward each other at the pace of people who had learned, through considerable experience, that the things worth having require patience and the willingness to let them arrive in their own time. Then Aradam's voice, drifting up from somewhere near his collarbone. Dad. Yes, Aradam. Your manners are much better now. A pause. I'm proud of you. Park Ho pressed his lips together hard, breathed once through his nose. Thank you, Aradam, he managed. You're welcome. She patted his arm. Consistency. I told you it was important. From the kitchen doorway, Celine covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders were shaking. Whether it was laughing or crying was not entirely clear. It didn't matter. Sometimes the two things arrive at exactly the same moment and become the same thing entirely. And in that small, warm living room, on a soft Sunday morning that smelled of market lilies and the approaching promise of jollof rice and chicken, a family that had been drawn in careful pencil strokes by a 7-year-old who knew before anyone else finally, completely, without drama or announcement, simply and at last, found its shape. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you personally and find out just how far our story is traveling. Because what happens next, when Park Ho gets the file, when he reads the date, when he looks up from that page and tells Do-won they are going back to the market. Nobody in that office was ready for it, and neither are you.